Picture this. It's 3 a.m. The ground beneath you is frozen solid. Your breath hangs in the air like smoke. Someone grabs your shoulder. It's your turn for guard duty. Outside, it's 15 below zero. Snow presses against the sides of a leather tent barely 4 feet tall. You're 18 years old, carrying 60 pounds of gear by day, and the only thing standing between you and death is the combined body heat of 7 other men. This wasn't a film set. This was a Tuesday for a Roman legionary on the Germanic frontier. Today, we're going to look at one of the most overlooked achievements in military history: how the Roman army kept tens of thousands of men alive, functional, and ready to fight in conditions that would break most people today. And the answer is more sophisticated than anything you'd expect from the ancient world. The Roman army wasn't just a war machine. It was a survival machine. And it all started before a single soldier shut his eyes. Call him Marcus. Marcus served with the Legio VI Augusta, recruited in Gallia Narbonensis, sometime in the 2nd century AD, at the peak of Rome's territorial reach. He learned early that surviving winter was a battle in its own right, and it started with the tent. The standard Roman military tent was called the Papilio, Latin for butterfly. The name is almost cruel in its irony, because there was nothing delicate about it. The Papilio was constructed from tanned goat or calf leather, treated with animal fat to repel water. It measured roughly 13 by 10 feet, about the size of a modest bedroom, and stood just tall enough to sit up in. No one stood upright inside. 8 men shared that space. 8 bodies, 8 sets of gear, 8 rations, 8 different histories. This smallest unit of the Roman army, the contubernium, slept together, marched together, ate together, and often died together. That forced closeness wasn't a social accident. It was thermal engineering. Researchers at the University of Newcastle calculated that 8 human bodies in an enclosed space of around 425 cubic feet generate enough heat to raise the internal temperature by up to 14 degrees Fahrenheit above the outside air. On a winter night in Roman Britain, that gap was the difference between waking up and not waking up. The tent itself weighed between 65 and 90 pounds, carried on a mule assigned to each contubernium. But the poles and stakes, those fell on the men themselves. The historian Vegetius called the loaded legionary a soldier with wooden wings. He wasn't being poetic. A man like Marcus carried between 55 and 66 pounds on his back. Armor, weapons, digging tools, rations, and camp hardware. And at the end of a 19-mile march, before he rested, he built. The tent was just the first layer. There's a very specific reason this entire system held together, even in Rome's most brutal campaigns. And I broke it all down in my book, The Art of War of the Roman Army, Strategies and Tactics that Shaped the World. There's a detail about how the camp layout directly shaped the next day's battle formation. One that completely changes how you read ancient Roman military history. The link is pinned in the comments. Marcus never slept in an open field if there was time to build a camp. No Roman soldier did. That was the rule, and it was never broken. The castrum, the Roman military camp, was one of antiquity's greatest logistical achievements. Where other armies saw a stopping place, the Romans built a temporary city. From scratch, every single night, after every march. The Greek historian Polybius, who lived among Romans in the 2nd century BC, described the castrum with barely concealed astonishment. Perpendicular streets, the praetorium at the center, drainage ditches running the perimeter, wooden palisades, watchtowers, every unit in its assigned position with near-surgical precision. When the army arrived at the night's campsite, half the men stood guard while the other half built. Then they switched. Total time to raise a fully functioning camp for 6,000 men, 2 to 3 hours. Let that land. A functional city for 6,000 people, built from nothing, in under 3 hours. The site itself was selected using criteria we'd recognize today as climate-conscious design, elevated ground to avoid cold pooling overnight, proximity to running water without excess moisture, natural windbreaks where possible, and deliberate orientation. The main gate always facing the enemy, combining military posture with practical function. Marcus knew the camp layout by heart. Every legionary did. When scouts returned with the location of that night's site, Marcus already knew exactly where to walk, where to drive the first stake, and how to orient the tent relative to the praetorium. The army moved like a single organism. And the ditch wasn't only defensive, it was drainage. The Romans understood that damp cold killed more reliably than dry cold. Waterlogged ground meant hypothermia, rotting feet, and deaths that would never appear in any battle report. The fossa channeled water away from the tents, keeping the camp drier, and therefore less deadly. Here's where Roman reality directly contradicts modern assumption. We think of good sleep as one unbroken block, 7, 8 hours. Roman legionaries slept in pieces. The night in the castrum was divided into 4 vigiliae, 4 guard shifts, each lasting roughly 3 hours, rotating through the century under the management of the optio, the unit's senior NCO. The tesserarius distributed tablets bearing the night's password and guard assignments. Every man knew in advance when his shift would come. On a typical night, Marcus might sleep 2 or 3 hours, rise for 2 hours of patrol in the freezing dark, then return to the tent for another 3 hours, fragmented by design. What modern researchers call biphasic sleep. The idea that human rest naturally breaks into 2 separate phases with a waking period between was simply the default existence of a Roman legionary. And growing evidence suggests this pattern may actually align better with pre-industrial human physiology than the rigid 8-hour block we try to maintain today. But the guard rotation wasn't only about security. It was a heating system. The men who patrolled during the 2nd and 3rd vigiliae, the coldest hours between midnight and dawn, kept moving. Movement generates body heat. When they returned to the tent after 2 hours in the cold, their bodies still radiated warmth into a space already heated by 6 sleeping men. Bodies going out cold, bodies coming back warm. A continuous thermal cycle that kept the interior of the Papilio from ever going fully cold. The Vindolanda tablets, remarkably preserved documents from Rome's British frontier, record this routine with the casual weariness of someone complaining about a work shift. One writer mentions the guard that fell to me in the 3rd Vigilia as though it were nothing more than an inconvenient rota. It was everything and nothing. The mundane machinery of an empire. Movies still show Roman soldiers in bare legs and open sandals in the dead of winter. That image belongs to a summer parade in the Mediterranean, not a February night on the Rhine. Archaeological finds along Hadrian's Wall tell a different story. Legionaries in cold provinces wore a long-sleeved linen undershirt beneath their tunic. Over the tunic, the sagum, a heavy wool cloak pinned at the shoulder, and on their legs the feminalia, wool or linen trousers reaching to the knee or ankle depending on the season. Feet received serious attention. The famous caligae, the hobnailed military sandal, were worn with thick wool socks called eudones. A letter recovered from Vindolanda, written by a soldier to his family, requests the delivery of socks, 2 pairs of underpants, and sandals. Direct, unglamorous proof that Roman legionaries thought hard about staying warm. When it came time to sleep, Marcus didn't strip down. Depending on the temperature, he kept at minimum his linen undershirt and feminalia, wrapping the sagum around himself as a blanket. The leather overhead held the heat. The bodies beside him generated more. But the ground was the real enemy. The ground pulls heat from the body 3 times faster than air at the same temperature. The Romans knew this in practice, if not in physics. Their solution was insulation. Straw, when available, was laid across the tent floor before anyone lay down, a practice noted in multiple Roman military texts. Cloaks were folded over the straw, and the men pressed against each other in rows, maximizing contact, turning the Papilio from a tent into something closer to a shared cocoon. There was even a quiet hierarchy inside. The Decanus, the contubernium's leader, slept in the center, warmest, furthest from the cold leather walls. Recruits slept on the edges. It was institutionalized discomfort with an unspoken incentive built in. Get promoted, sleep warmer. Roman military logistics didn't separate nutrition from survival. For the men who designed the legion's supply system, eating was thermal strategy. and the soldiers' diet reflected that. The two pillars of the legionary diet were posca and pulse. Posca was vinegar mixed with water. Sour, harsh, nothing a modern diner would order. But its mild antibacterial properties made it safer than plain water in a camp of thousands, and it provided electrolytes. Pulse was a dense porridge of spelt or cracked wheat, eaten hot whenever possible. A bowl of hot pulse before sleep raised core body temperature by a degree or more. Enough warmth to carry a man through the opening stages of the sleep cycle before the cold began to reassert itself. Food as pharmacology, without the terminology but with the effect. Animal fat was equally critical. Lard, pork fat, was a standard campaign ration, stirred into the pulse or eaten alongside hard bread. Fat metabolizes slowly, releasing heat for hours after consumption. A soldier on a high-fat diet held the cold at bay better than one surviving on carbohydrates alone. Arctic peoples discovered this independently. Modern physiology confirms it. The Romans applied it centuries before either. Wine, diluted as Roman custom demanded, rounded out the evening meal. Not enough to impair. That would be a security risk, but enough to gently raise peripheral body temperature and ease the descent into sleep. Pliny the Elder himself wrote about wine's warming effects in cold climates, and the Roman army institutionalized this into standard rations for northern campaigns. Marcus, sitting with his 7 companions around the small fire before sleep, was participating in something that combined nutrition, warmth, social bonding, and rest preparation into a single ritual. The Contubernium's fire, controlled to limit smoke, sometimes lit outside under a leather canopy, was the gravitational center of the legionaries' evening. The pulse bubbled in the iron pot. The wine warmed in clay cups. Men talked or sat in silence or threw dice. Humanity lived in that space. It always does, where there is fire and shared food. If this operational side of Roman military life pulls at you, the art of war of the Roman army goes deeper into how this same survival infrastructure shaped the outcome of the conquest of Gaul, the Rhine crossings, and Trajan's Dacian wars. How much of those campaigns was decided before the first sword was drawn? The link is in the comments. The man who made all of this function wasn't the centurion. He had larger concerns. It was the optio, the century's senior NCO, who ran the nightly routine with a combination of authority, pragmatism, and occasional hard discipline. The optio ensured guard changes happened on time, that no man served beyond his shift and accumulated dangerous exhaustion, and that men inside the tents didn't waste their rest windows lying awake. Wasted sleep was wasted combat capacity. The Roman army understood this with a precision most modern militaries only arrived at in the 20th century. The Vindolanda tablets record punishments for soldiers who fell asleep on guard. A serious offense carrying the risk of flogging or, in extreme cases, the fustuarium. A collective beating administered by the contubernium itself. The logic was brutally simple. Fall asleep on watch and the enemy walks in. Your careless sleep kills your companions. This made vigilance a matter of personal loyalty, not just institutional rule. But the optio also defended the men's right to sleep. There are rare records of centurions being formally reprimanded for waking their sentries for unnecessary nighttime drills or inspections outside regulated hours. The legionaries' sleep was a military resource. Squandering it was as reckless as burning rations or rusting iron. Marcus had learned to fall asleep fast. Veterans taught recruits this skill with blunt efficiency. Lie down, close your eyes immediately, don't think. The ability to drop into sleep within minutes was a genuine survival advantage in a system where rest windows were short and unpredictable. A 10-year veteran could be unconscious in 2 minutes on bare rock. Recruits learned. The body adapts when it has no choice. Everything described so far applied to the army on the march, what the Romans called the agmen. But the legions also stopped. The Romans called it hiberna, winter quarters. The permanent or semi-permanent camps where legions settled between October and March, when campaigns paused by the tacit agreement of everyone involved. Winter was not for war. It was for recovery, training, maintenance, and above all, building. In the hiberna, leather tents gave way to wooden structures, legionaries. Engineers as much as soldiers, as Vegetius never tired of pointing out. Constructed barracks with raised floors to combat ground moisture, internal partitions to trap warm air, and at the more established posts, simplified versions of the Hippocrates system Rome had developed for its bathhouses, warm air circulating beneath wooden floorboards. Excavations at Housesteads fort along Hadrian's Wall revealed barracks housing 10 to 12 men, with clear evidence of central fireplaces and internal layouts optimized for shared heat. Men slept in double wooden bunks, confirmed at multiple excavation sites, which lifted their bodies off the cold ground and created a stable pocket of accumulated warmth between the two levels. Time moved differently in the Hiberna. Morning training continued regardless of weather. Routine was the glue that held an army together, but afternoons and evenings opened up. Equipment maintenance, rest, and the military bathhouses that accompanied virtually every major Roman frontier post. Hot baths served soldiers' muscles and joints, ravaged by months of heavy marching. The warmth was therapeutic in every sense. Marcus, in his winters on the Germanic frontier, probably slept more soundly, ate better, and stayed warmer than at any other point in the year. The Roman winter was brutal. It was also the winter the Roman army had learned to outlast better than anyone else in the ancient world. For centuries, historians framed the Roman legionaries' endurance in the cold as a matter of iron discipline. Men who simply endured where others failed, driven by fear of punishment or some uniquely Roman cultural toughness. There's truth in that. But it leaves out the most important piece. Roman legionaries didn't just survive the cold. They were built to thrive in it. The recruitment process filtered for physical specifics. Minimum height, broad chest, powerful limbs. But the training, the long, grinding process of converting a civilian into a legionary, did something more fundamental. It systematically conditioned the men's autonomic nervous systems to respond to thermal stress differently. Recruits marched under full load in rain and cold from their first weeks of training. They were required to sleep in the open before they were permitted to use a tent. They were kept awake, then allowed to sleep irregular hours, then abruptly woken. A deliberate cycle of disruption that, over months, the body came to accept as normal. What would constitute sleep deprivation for a civilian was simply Tuesday night for a 10-year veteran. This adaptation was physiologically real. Modern research on military personnel put through extreme survival training shows that after 6 to 8 weeks of gradual cold exposure, the human body develops measurably more efficient thermoregulatory responses, better vasoconstriction, higher baseline heat production, more effective sleep in cold environments. The body learns to stay warm on less energy. The Romans had a word for this forged state, virtus. Usually translated as virtue or courage, the word originally described a physical quality, the capacity of the male body to endure, resist, and persist. The legionary's virtus wasn't only battlefield bravery, it was a biological and psychological readiness to function where others collapsed. And beneath it all ran something the sources mention only obliquely, something that only makes full sense when you hold all of this together. 8 men sleeping inches apart for years, sharing warmth on the coldest nights, waking together, surviving together. Developed a bond that modern military psychology calls small unit cohesion, and which the Romans simply called fraternitas, brotherhood. That bond had measurable physical effects. The presence of trusted companions reduces the body's stress response, lowers cortisol, and improves sleep quality. A man who sleeps among 7 people, he would die for sleeps better, even in worse conditions, than a man alone in a heated room full of strangers. The Roman camp system wasn't just engineering and logistics. It was applied psychology for cold climates. And the fraternitas of the contubernium was an emotional warmth that translated directly and literally into physical warmth. If you want to understand how this army truly worked from the inside, from the tactical to the deeply human, the art of war of the Roman army is where that journey continues. It's not surface-level history, it's the depth behind the depth. The link is pinned in the comments. Not every night in the castrum was the same. Marcus had fought in 3 major engagements before he reached his 30s. And he would tell you, if you could ask him, that the night before a battle was categorically different from all the others. Not exactly fear, something more physical, more primal. A hypervigilance that moved through the entire camp like a current no one could name. On those nights, the Roman army followed protocols refined across generations. Caesar describes them in the Gallic Wars with a terseness that barely contains the weight behind it. Men were fed more than usual. Reinforced meat rations, when available, wine in slightly greater quantity than normal. Not generosity. Calculation. A well-fed man fights longer. A man who slept, even in fragments, even with adrenaline tearing through him, reacts faster than an exhausted one. Paradoxically, the nights before battle were the nights when the Roman rest system operated with the most rigor, not the least. The army's priests, pontifices, and haruspices performed religious rites on the eve of engagement. Sacrifices were made, omens were read, and this ritualization served a function we would recognize today as collective anxiety management, turning formless dread into structured action, giving men something deliberate to do rather than stare at the tent ceiling. Roman religious ritual allowed the mind to settle just enough for sleep. Marcus lay down that night among his 7 companions and felt what he always felt, the familiar warmth of bodies he knew completely. Titus, whose snoring drove everyone to the edge. Flavius, who always curled up with his knees drawn to his chest. Servius, the oldest, who had called them all boys since the first day and never stopped. These men were his camp within the camp, his warmth inside the cold, his certainty inside the uncertainty. When the buccinator sounded the 4th Vigilia, the sky still black, frost still white on the grass, Marcus opened his eyes with the rest of them, felt the sharp cold pouring through the tent flap, and got up, not because he was brave, because the 7 men beside him were getting up, because the entire army was getting up, because the castrum, built in 2 hours, soon to be dismantled in 1, had done its job. It had delivered living men to the dawn. The sun rose over the plain. The Roman army formed up, and for a few hours, the cold stopped mattering. The story of Roman sleep doesn't end with the fall of the empire. It transforms. The Crusaders of the 11th century reproduced the structure of the Roman castrum, often without knowing it, because the military manuals available to them, treatises like Maurice's Strategicon or the works of Vegetius, drew directly from the Roman tradition. The medieval armies that dug organized camp ditches, rotated guard shifts, and maintained unit discipline through the night were drinking from a source 2,000 years deep. The small unit system, the contubernum and its logic of shared warmth, mutual accountability, and psychological cohesion, reappears in different form in every elite military force in modern history. The 8 to 12-man combat team, universal across contemporary armies, has its roots in Roman wisdom about the optimal number of bodies for shared heat, collective responsibility, and the kind of trust that makes men functional in the dark. Rome's wars were not won only on the battlefield. They were won on the nights before. In leather tents where 8 men lay pressed together, where porridge bubbled in the iron pot and wine warmed in clay cups, where the Optio made his rounds and confirmed that everyone was sleeping, where the silent castrum breathed the frozen breath of 6,000 living men. That was Roman military life. Not the polished armor of the statues, not the heroism of the frescoes. It was leather, straw, wool, and pork fat. Fragmented sleep, and the brotherhood of 8 men who understood that the only warmth on offer was each other. It was enough to conquer the world. Which aspect of Roman military life do you want explored next? Training, food, punishment, relationships with conquered peoples? Tell me in the comments. You shape the next script. If this added something to your day, hit like and subscribe. Every like tells the algorithm this kind of history is worth keeping alive. The link to The Art of War of the Roman Army is pinned in the comments. The perfect companion for going deeper into this world. See you in the next video.